In the days following the War of the Ring, when peace had settled upon the lands of Gondor like morning dew upon the Pelennor fields, there came word to the Tower of Ecthelion that troubled King Elessar greatly. The messenger who bore these tidings was no common courier, but Beregond of the Guard, his face grave beneath his helm of silver and black. "My lord," spoke Beregond, bowing low before the throne of Gondor, "there comes word from the marshlands that lie betwixt Emyn Muil and the Morannon. Strange lights have been seen dancing above the waters, and the dead that once lay still beneath the mere now stir with unquiet purpose." Aragorn, son of Arathorn, leaned forward upon his throne, his grey eyes dark with concern. "The dead marshes have long been a place of sorrow and shadow. What manner of stirring troubles the ancient slumber of those who fell in the last alliance? Sire, the rangers who patrol those borders speak of a woman's voice that calls across the waters in the tongue of ancient Númenor. They say she seeks passage to the Grey Havens, though none living dwells in those accursed fens. The marsh folk flee their homes, and even the hardiest of fishermen dare not cast their nets in those waters." The king rose from his seat, his hand resting upon the hilt of Andúril. "Then we must know the truth of this matter. Summon to me Faramir, Prince of Ithilien, and let him choose from among his rangers those most skilled in woodcraft and versed in the lore of the elder days. This mystery shall not remain unsolved, whilst darkness may yet threaten the peace we have so dearly won." Thus it was that within 3 days a company was assembled in the courtyard of the citadel. Faramir himself would lead them, accompanied by 6 rangers of Ithilien, each chosen for their courage and their knowledge of the wild places of Middle-earth. Among them rode Mablung the Tall, who had served with honor in the war, and young Anborn, whose eyes were keen as those of the hawks that nested in the cliffs of Emyn Arnon. "My lord," said Faramir to his king as they prepared to depart, "if this voice speaks in the tongue of Númenor, then we may have need of one learned in the speech of the West. Perhaps one of the scholars of the houses of healing might accompany us?" "Nay," replied Aragorn, "for I have in mind another who may serve this purpose better. Send word to Dol Amroth, and bid Prince Imrahil send his daughter, the Lady Lothiriel, who among all the learned of Gondor knows best the ancient tongues and the lore of the Sea King." And so the company was made complete, 8 souls bound for the dead marshes, where shadow and sorrow held dominion still. Though the Dark Lord had passed away, and his servants were scattered like leaves before the wind, the swan ship that bore the Lady Lothiriel from Dol Amroth came up the Anduin like a vision from the elder days, her sails white as foam, and her prow carved in the likeness of a swan's neck. Upon the quay of Harlond she was met by Prince Faramir himself, who bowed deeply before the daughter of Imrahil. Lothiriel was fair to look upon, with the dark hair and grey eyes of the Dúnedain, yet in her bearing was something of the sea-longing that marked the blood of those who had sailed from Númenor in the far-off years. She was clad for travel in a cloak of deep blue, and at her side hung a blade of ancient make that had been her grandfather's in the days before Sauron's shadow fell upon the south. "My lady," said Faramir, "I thank you for answering the king's summons with such haste. The matter that draws us to the dead marshes is one that may require all your learning in the tongues of the West." "Prince Faramir," she replied, and her voice was clear as silver bells upon the morning air, "my father has told me somewhat of this mystery. A woman's voice that speaks in the Adunaic tongue, such a thing has not been heard in Middle-earth for nigh on 3,000 years. If there is truth in these reports, then we ride toward something that may shake the very foundations of our understanding of what transpired in those ancient days." The rangers had made ready their horses and provision for a journey of many days, for the dead marshes lay far to the north and east, beyond the fields of the Pelennor and the hills of Ithilien. As they rode forth from Minas Tirith in the grey dawn, the white tree stood sentinel above them, its blossoms pale in the early light, like stars that had not yet faded from the sky. Their path led them first through the fair realm of Ithilien, where Faramir had labored long to cleanse the land of the shadow that had lain upon it. Here the gardens bloomed anew, and the streams ran clear, and the rangers who dwelt in hidden halls beneath the hill worked to restore what war had ravaged. Yet as they traveled ever northward and eastward, the land grew wilder and more desolate, until at last they came to the borders of that region where few dared to tread. Upon the second evening of their journey, as they made camp beside a stream that flowed down from the Emin Muil, the Lady Lothiriel spoke words that would prove prophetic in days to come. "There is something in the wind tonight that speaks of the sea," she said, gazing toward the distant marshes where mist was beginning to rise. "Yet we are far from any shore, and the nearest water that knows the tide is the Bay of Belfalas, many leagues to the south. This is passing strange, for the dead should not dream of the sea unless they bore some great love or sorrow connected to the wave." Mablung, who sat sharpening his sword beside the fire, looked up from his work. "My lady speaks truly. In all my years of ranging through these lands, I have never known the dead marsh to carry the scent of salt water. Perhaps this woman who calls in the ancient tongue was herself of the seafaring folk. Perhaps," said Lothiriel thoughtfully, "or perhaps she seeks something that lies beneath the waves of that inland sea of sorrow. Tomorrow we shall learn more, for I have studied the maps, and by evening we should come within sight of those accursed waters." The third day of their journey dawned gray and cheerless, with mist hanging low over the land like a shroud. As they rode ever deeper into the wild country that bordered the dead marshes, the very air seemed to grow thick and oppressive, and their horses became restless and hard to manage. Even the hardy steeds of Rohan that bore the rangers seemed to sense the unquiet that lay ahead. It was near the hour of noon when they first glimpsed the waters of the dead marshes stretching away to the north and east like a sea of tarnished silver. The sight was one to chill the heart, for beneath the surface could be seen the faces of the dead, warriors of Gilgalad and Elendil who had fallen in the battle of Dagorlad, their features pale and unchanging as they had been for nigh on 3,000 years. "By the valor," whispered young Anborn, "I had heard tell of this sight, but seeing it with mine own eyes, how can such sorrow endure through all the turning of the years?" "The dead do not rest easy when they perish in great anguish of spirit," replied Faramir. "These were brave men who died far from home, fighting against the darkness that threatened all the free peoples. Their sacrifice was not in vain, yet still they linger here, unable to find peace." The Lady Lothiriel had dismounted, and was kneeling beside the water's edge, her hand cupped to her ear, as if listening to some distant sound. When she rose, her face was troubled. "The voice is here," she said softly. "I can hear it now, faint but clear beneath the lapping of the water. She speaks in the ancient tongue of Numenor, and her words are full of longing and loss." She paused, concentrating intently. "She calls for Elendil. She speaks of ships and a white city by the sea, and she names herself." Here Lothiriel's voice faltered, and she grew pale as moonlight. "What name does she speak, my lady?" asked Faramir with growing urgency. "She calls herself Elendiliel," Lothiriel whispered, "daughter of Elendil, sister to Isildur and Anarion. But that cannot be, for the histories tell us that Elendil had no daughter, only his 2 sons, who founded the kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor." A great silence fell upon the company, for if this were true, then all the histories of the elder days might need to be rewritten. Mablung was the first to find his voice. "Perhaps the voice lies, or perhaps it is some evil spirit that seeks to deceive us with false claim." But Lothiriel shook her head slowly. "Nay, there is truth in what she speaks, though how this can be, I cannot fathom. Listen." She held up her hand, and in the stillness they could all hear it now, a woman's voice calling across the waters in words of heartbreaking beauty and sorrow. The ancient Adunaic flowed like music across the marsh. "Elendel aran, atarnin, nan Numenor, uve tuluva, si linna isure, ari eleni firiar, tuluvastane I mornia, ar lasto beth din." "What does she say?" asked Faramir urgently. Lothiriel's eyes were bright with unshed tears, as she translated, "Elendel the king, my father. To Numenor I would return. Now the wind fails, and the stars die. The darkness has come, and listen to this word." As night fell upon the dead marshes, the company made their camp upon a rise of land that stood above the waterline, though even here the ground was soft and treacherous beneath their feet. They lit no fire, for the marshes were full of gases that might ignite with dangerous force, and they ate cold provisions while keeping watch upon the waters below. The voice of Elendeliel grew stronger as darkness deepened, and now they could see lights moving beneath the surface. Not the pale corpse candles that had long haunted these waters, but a different radiance altogether, blue-white and pure as starlight. The Lady Lothiriel sat apart from the others, her head bowed in concentration as she listened to the ancient words that drifted up from the depths. "She speaks now of a ship," Lothiriel said softly to Faramir, who sat beside her keeping watch. "A white ship with silver sails that bore her from the drowning of Numenor. But something went amiss during the voyage. She speaks of a great storm that scattered the fleet of her father, and how her vessel was driven far from its course. Could it be," asked Faramir thoughtfully, "that she was lost at sea during the flight from Numenor, and her spirit somehow found its way to these inland waters?" "I know not," replied Lothiriel, "but there is more. She speaks of a burden she bore, something that was entrusted to her safekeeping by her father before the ships sailed from Ravenna, something that must not fall into the enemy's hands, even though Sauron himself was destroyed in the drowning of the island." At that moment, the waters began to glow more brightly, and rising from the depth came a figure that caused all the company to gasp in wonder and fear. It was indeed a woman, tall and fair after the manner of the Númenórean, her dark hair flowing about her like seaweed, her white robes streaming with water that seemed to shine with its own light. Her face was noble and sad, bearing the unmistakable features of the House of Elendel. She walked upon the surface of the marsh as if it were solid ground, her feet leaving no ripple in their wake. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the water to where the company waited in breathless silence. "Fair Lin na Cheren si, ar orthad nuin Gondor, dad ben na nganen, Isildur Ioneg, Anarion Ioneg, pen neth uir, ar ichuven lin gwenen." The ancient Sindarin rolled from her lips like music, and Lothiriel translated with growing amazement. "Your spirit is now red, and the secret of Gondor rises. I am fallen but calling, son of Isildur, son of Anarion. She speaks of the last daughter of fire, and your time of meeting is revealed." The phantom woman, for phantom she surely was, though fair beyond the beauty of mortal women, raised her hand in greeting, and upon her finger gleamed a ring that caught the starlight like captured fire. But it was not one of the great rings that Celebrimbor had wrought, nor any work of the elven smiths. This was something far older and more terrible. "By the stars," breathed Faramir, his warrior's eye marking every detail of the apparition. "What ring is that she bears?" But even as he spoke, the figure began to fade, and her voice grew distant once more. "Istelio amensila, ar ugarnen nambeth, eglerio uin Gondor," she says, whispered Lothiriel, her face now pale as snow. "Knowledge to us shines, and death unsheathed speaks. Glorify the waters of Gondor." And with those words, the Lady Elendeliel sank beneath the waters once more, leaving only ripples that quickly stilled, and the memory of starlight upon dark water. Dawn brought no relief from the oppressive atmosphere of the dead marshes, and the company found themselves debating in hushed tones what they had witnessed in the night. The Lady Lothiriel had slept little, spending the hours before sunrise in deep study of such ancient texts as she had brought with her from Dol Amroth. "I have searched through all the genealogies of the House of Elendel," she said as they broke their fast on whey bread and water from their own skins, "and nowhere is there mention of a daughter. Yet the woman we saw bore the unmistakable features of that royal line, and she knew things that no deceiving spirit could know, the names of the ships, the details of the flight from Numenor, even words in the ancient tongue that have been forgotten for an age of the world." Faramir nodded grimly. And that ring she bore, I have seen its like in the ancient tapestries that hang in the houses of lore. It was wrought in the image of those that Sauron gave to the 9 kings who became the Nazgul, yet it bore no taint of evil that I could perceive. Perhaps, suggested Mablung, it was one of the lesser rings, made before Sauron revealed his treachery to the elven smiths. But Lothiriel shook her head. Nay, I think it was something else entirely. In the archives of Dol Amroth, there are references to rings of power that were made not by the elves, but by the Númenóreans themselves in the days of their glory. Rings that could preserve the spirit beyond the death of the body. Rings that could grant passage between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Young Anborn, who had been silent through much of this discourse, suddenly spoke up. My lords, while you have been talking, I have been watching the waters, and I swear I can see something moving beneath the surface. Not the faces of the dead warriors, but something else, something that glints like metal in the depths. They all turned to look where he pointed, and indeed, there was something there, a shape that seemed too regular to be natural, lying far beneath the dark water. As they watched, the glow that had marked the coming of Elendiliel began to appear again, and the water above the object grew clear as crystal. It is a ship, breathed Faramir in amazement. A Númenórean ship, perfectly preserved beneath the water. And so it was, a vessel of the ancient design, her prow carved in the likeness of a swan's neck, her masts still standing though bare of sail. Upon her deck they could make out the forms of mariners, as perfectly preserved as the warriors of the last alliance. And in the stern sat a figure robed in white, who could be none other than Elendiliel herself. She has been waiting, whispered Lothiriel, waiting through all these long years for someone to come who could understand her words and help her complete the task that was left unfinished when her ship was driven into these inland waters by the great storm. As if in response to these words, the water began to stir, and once again the Phantom Princess rose from the depths. This time she did not walk upon the surface, but stood waist-deep in the marsh, her hands extended toward them in a gesture of supplication. When she spoke, it was not in the ancient tongues, but in the common speech, though her voice carried still the music of Númenor. Children of Gondor, heirs of my father's kingdom, I have waited long for this hour. The burden that I bear grows heavier with each passing year, and I fear that if it is not soon lifted from me, even the power of the ring will not suffice to hold my spirit to this world. Lady, replied Faramir with all the courtesy due to one of royal blood, we have come at the bidding of King Elessar to learn the cause of the disturbance in these waters. Tell us what burden you bear, and if it lies within our power, we will aid you. The Phantom Princess gazed upon them with eyes that held the depth of seas and the sorrow of ages, and when she spoke again, her words sent a chill through every heart. Know then, children of the Second Age's ending, that I am indeed Elendiliel, daughter of Elendil the Tall, whom history has forgotten because my father deemed it safer that I should not be remembered. For I was the keeper of the greatest and most dangerous of all the Palantiri, the Master Stone of Númenor, which could command all others and see across the circles of the world. The company exchanged glances of amazement and fear, for the Seeing Stones had ever been things of great power and peril. Faramir knew well the tale of Denethor's madness, brought on by his use of the Palantir of Minas Tirith, and of how Saruman had been ensnared by the Stone of Orthanc. When the island began to sink beneath the waves, Elendiliel continued, My father entrusted this stone to my keeping, for he feared that if it fell into the hands of those who served Gil-galad and Elrond, they might seek to use its power to oppose Sauron directly. Such was its might that it could have shown them the location of every orc and every servant of darkness throughout Middle-earth. But at what cost? For the Master Stone was bound by ancient enchantment to the will of its maker. And who was its maker, lady? Asked Lothiriel, though her voice trembled as she spoke. Sauron himself, in the days before he revealed his treachery, when he still walked among the Númenóreans as their counselor and friend. He gave it to Ar-Pharazôn as a gift, claiming it would allow the king to watch over all his dominions. But in truth, it was a trap. Any who used it to spy upon Sauron's works would gradually fall under his dominion, as did my kinsman Ar-Pharazôn in the end. The waters around the phantom grew darker. He spoke these words, as if the very memory of that ancient treachery could dim the light that sustained her spirit. My ship was driven far from the course that should have brought me to Gilgalad's haven in Lindon, she continued. A great storm arose, whether by chance or by the malice of the enemy, I know not, and my vessel was swept inland by waters that rose higher than any flood in the memory of Middle-earth. When the storm passed, we found ourselves trapped in these marshes, which were then fair lakes, surrounded by green meadows. "And you have remained here ever since?" asked Faramir. "Aye, for the stone would not permit me to depart. Its power holds me bound to this place, and every year the burden grows heavier. I have watched the rise and fall of kingdoms, the coming of the Nazgul to Minas Morgul, the long defeat of my people, and still I could not rest. The ring upon my finger preserves my spirit from fading, but it cannot grant me peace while the stone remains in my keeping." Anborn, whose young eyes were sharp, pointed toward the sunken ship. "Lady, if the stone lies aboard your vessel, why can you not simply cast it into the depths, where it might trouble no one?" Elendil's laugh was like silver bells touched by frost. "Young ranger, think you that I have not tried? But the stone is bound to me by oaths spoken in the hall of Ar-Pharazôn, oaths that can only be broken by one of the blood of Elendil, who willingly takes the burden upon himself. And therein lies the trap that Sauron wrought. For what heir of Elendil would willingly doom himself to an eternity of guardianship over that accursed thing?" The implications of her words settled upon the company like a heavy cloak, and they looked upon Faramir with new understanding. For he alone among them bore the blood of Elendil through his descent from the house of Hurin, of Emin Arnon, which traced its lineage back to Anarion himself. "You are asking me," said Faramir slowly, "to take upon myself a burden that would bind my spirit to this place for all the years of the world?" "Nay," replied Elendil, and for the first time since her appearance, hope flickered in her eyes. "For I have learned much during these long years of watching, and I believe there may be another way, a way that would free us both and render the stone powerless forever. But it would require great courage and great sacrifice from all who aid in the attempt." Though, as the day wore on, and the mists of the dead marshes grew thicker about them, the Lady Elendil led the company to a place she had not shown to mortal eyes for many centuries, the ruins of her ship's landing place, where stone quays built by her mariners still stood beneath the dark water. Here, she explained, they might converse more freely, for the power of her ring was strongest in this spot. The quays rose like ghost-white islands from the marsh, their stones carved with the tree and stars of Elendil's house, and inscribed with Tengwar letters that gleamed faintly in the gathering dusk. Upon the largest of these platforms, the company made their council, while Elendil stood upon the water nearby, her form growing more solid and real as night approached. "Hear then the plan that 3,000 years of thought have brought me," she said, her voice clear in the still air. "The Master Stone cannot be destroyed by any earthly means, for it was wrought with the skill of the Maya Sauron, and hardened in the fires of Orodruin, before ever that mountain was corrupted by his evil. But it can be rendered harmless if it is carried beyond the circles of the world, to the undying land where the Valar dwell." "Yet how could such a thing be accomplished?" asked Faramir. "The straight road that leads to Valinor is closed to mortal men, save only to the ring-bearers who sailed from the Grey Haven. Therein lies both the difficulty and the hope of my plan," replied Elendil, "for I have learned through long communion with the spirits of the elves, who sometimes pass through these waters, that Círdan the shipwright yet dwells at the haven, and his power to build ships that can sail the straight road is not diminished. But he would never consent to bear such a burden to the blessed realm, unless—" "Unless what, lady?" pressed Lothiriel. "Unless one who bore the burden was already marked for sailing into the west, and here fate plays a part that even I could not have foreseen, for among you rides one whose spirit bears a wound that will not heal in Middle-earth, a wound taken in service to the light, which grants the right of passage to the undying lands. All eyes turned to Faramir, for indeed he bore such a wound, not of the body, but of the spirit, taken when he had gazed into the palantir of Minas Tirith in his youth and seen visions that had shaken his mind. Though he had recovered, the shadow of that encounter lingered still, and the wise had long said that he might one day need to seek healing beyond the sea. "You are saying," Faramir said slowly, "that I must take the stone upon myself, carry it to the Grey Havens, and sail with it into the west, leaving Middle-earth forever?" "Not forever," replied Elendiliel, and now her voice carried a note of joy that had not been heard in it before. "For in the undying lands time flows differently, and what seems an age to those who remain may be but a year to those who dwell there. Moreover, there is this to consider. If you bear the burden willingly, as one already granted the right of passage, then the binding that holds me here would be broken, and I, too, could find rest." Mablung, ever practical in his thinking, asked the question that troubled them all. "But how are we to retrieve this stone from the depths where it lies? None of us can walk beneath the water as you do, lady." Elendiliel smiled, and it was like sunrise breaking through clouds. "That difficulty is not so great as it seems, for the power of my ring extends to all who are within this sacred circle. If one among you has the courage to descend with me to the ship, I can grant him the ability to breathe water as air, and to move through the depths as freely as upon dry land." "I will go," said Faramir without hesitation, for he was ever one to face danger in the forefront. But Elendiliel shook her head. "Nay, Prince of Ithilien, for if you touch the stone before the proper rituals are performed, its power will bind you to this place immediately. Another must retrieve it and bring it to the surface, where the transfer can be made safely." She looked upon the company with eyes that seemed to weigh each soul. "Who among you has the strength of will to descend into that haunted place and return with sanity intact?" To their surprise, it was the Lady Lothiriel who stepped forward. "I will go, for I am of the blood of Numenor, and the sight of that drowned ship will not drive me to madness, as it might others. Moreover, I have studied the lore of the Palantiri, and I know the words that must be spoken to contain their power during transport. The hour before dawn was chosen for the descent, when the power of the ring was at its strongest, and the waters of the marsh lay still as glass. The Lady Elendiliel had spent much of the night teaching Lothiriel the ancient words that must be spoken, and the precise manner in which the Master Stone must be handled, for one false move could result in disaster not only for the bearer, but for all Middle-earth. "Remember," the Phantom Princess said, as they prepared for the descent, "you must not look directly into the stone while you carry it, for even wrapped in its shroud of silk, it retains power enough to ensnare the unwary. Keep your eyes fixed upon my form, and follow where I lead, no matter what visions or voices may attempt to turn you aside." Lothiriel had donned her lightest garment, and bound her dark hair back with a silver circlet that had been her grandmother's. In her hands she carried a pouch of waterproof leather, lined with cloth of silver from Lorien, which Elendiliel had assured her would contain the stone's influence during the ascent. As the Phantom Princess extended her hand, Lothiriel felt a strange tingling spread through her limbs, and suddenly the dark water seemed no more forbidding than the fountains in the courts of Dol Amroth. She could breathe the marsh water as easily as air, and her limbs moved with surprising grace as she followed Elendiliel down into the depth, the descent like falling through liquid starlight, for the power of the ring illuminated their path with a soft blue radiance. Around them swirled the faces of the dead warriors, elves and men who had fallen at Dagorlad, but they seemed unaware of the living woman who passed among them. Their eyes remained fixed upon some distant vision, and their lips moved as if speaking words that only they could hear. Deeper and deeper they sank, until at last the shadow of the sunken ship loomed before them like a cathedral built of sorrow and time. She was beautiful still, despite her long sojourn beneath the waters, her lines clean and graceful after the manner of Numenorian shipwrights. Her name was carved upon her prow in letters that still gleamed, Arundel's star, and Lothiriel realized with a start that this vessel must have been named for the great mariner who bore a Silmaril into the heavens. She was the swiftest ship in all the fleet of Elendil, said Elendiliel as they glided toward the vessel's deck. My father gave her to me because he knew that speed might be needed to keep the stone from falling into the wrong hand. Little did he know that speed would avail nothing against the power of storm and flood. The deck was crowded with the forms of mariners who had died at their post, their faces peaceful in the eternal sleep that had claimed them. But it was toward the stern castle that Elendiliel led her companion, to a cabin whose door bore the seal of the House of Elendil, wrought in mithril and gold. Within the cabin, upon a table of black marble from the mountains of Numenor, sat the Master Stone. Lothiriel had expected something imposing, but the Palantir seemed almost modest, a sphere of dark crystal about the size of a man's head, resting in a stand of carved silver. Yet even wrapped as it was in veils of spider silk from Lorien, she could sense the terrible power that slumbered within it. The very air around the stone seemed to thicken, and whispers in languages she did not know echoed at the edges of her mind. Quickly now, urged Elendiliel, for even my power cannot long protect you from its influence in so confined a space. With hands that trembled only slightly, Lothiriel opened the waterproof pouch and began to recite the words she had been taught. Elen sila lumen omentielvo, palantir Numenor. La eleni anka luva tieliana, ar isura tieliana uva runa. The ancient Quenya rolled from her tongue like music, and as she spoke, the whispers grew fainter, and the oppressive weight of the stone's presence seemed to lessen. Carefully, reverently, she lifted the sphere from its stand and placed it within the pouch, where the cloth of silver immediately wrapped itself about it like living things. But as she sealed the pouch, a voice spoke clearly in her mind, not the voice of Elendiliel, but something older and more terrible. Daughter of the Sea Kings, you know not what you do. The stone shows only truth, and there are truths in your future that would break your heart to know. Look upon me, and I will show you the fate of all you hold dear. For a moment, Lothiriel wavered, her hand moving toward the sealed pouch. But then she remembered the faces of her companions waiting above, and the long sorrow of Elendiliel, and she turned her eyes resolutely away. I will not look, she said aloud, for some truths are too heavy for mortal hearts to bear. And with those words, the voice fell silent, and she knew that she had passed the stone's first and greatest test. The ascent from the depths of the marsh seemed to take far longer than the descent, though Elendiliel assured her companion that they rose with all the speed that safety would allow. The Master Stone, even contained within its shielded pouch, seemed to grow heavier with each fathom they climbed, until Lothiriel felt as though she carried the weight of mountains upon her shoulders. When at last they broke the surface near the ruined quays, the first light of dawn was touching the eastern horizon, and the company of rangers stood ready with all the preparations that Elendiliel had commanded. They had built a circle of stones upon the largest platform, each stone carved with a letter of the ancient Tengwar script, and filled with silver from the mines of the lonely mountain that Mablung had carried in his pack for the mending of weapons. In the center of the circle lay a cloak of deep blue, woven with threads of mithril, Faramir's own cloak of state, which he had offered willingly for this purpose. Upon this would rest the Master Stone during the ritual of binding, while the words of power were spoken that would transfer its guardianship from Elendiliel to him. "Is all prepared?" asked the Phantom Princess as she helped Lothiriel onto the platform. The Lady of Dol Amroth was pale but resolute, clutching the sealed pouch to her breast as if it contained her own heart. "All is as you have commanded, lady," replied Faramir, though his voice betrayed the weight of what he was about to undertake. I have written letters to my wife and to the king, explaining my choice, and Mablung has sworn to bear them south when our task is complete. Then let us begin, said Elendil, for the sun rises, and with it comes the time when my power wanes. If the ritual is not completed before the day grows bright, we must wait another turning of the seasons for such an opportunity to come again. Lothiriel placed the pouch gently upon the mithril-woven cloak, and immediately the stones of the circle began to glow with a soft silver light. The air above the platform shimmered like heat haze, though the morning was cool, and all could sense that powers were stirring that had not been awakened for many an age. Elendil began to speak in the ancient tongue of Numenor, her voice rising and falling like the rhythm of waves upon a distant shore. Istelio amensila, Elendelaran, Ugarnan naboen dagorlath, Arai palantir ua mayan, Tol acharn, Ar orthad nuin I nagurth. As she spoke these words, the pouch began to unfold of its own accord, and the master stone was revealed in all its dark glory. No longer veiled by spider silk, it pulsed with an inner fire that was neither wholly dark nor wholly light, but something between the two, the color of twilight over the sea, or of stars reflected in deep water. Faramir stepped forward into the circle, and as his feet crossed the boundary, marked by the silver-filled stones, he felt a change come over him. It was as if he suddenly stood at the edge of a great precipice, with eternity yawning before him like a vast ocean. Fear touched his heart, but also a strange sense of peace, for he knew that he followed in the footsteps of heroes who had given their lives for the freedom of Middle-earth. "Speak now the words that I have taught you," commanded Elendil, "and let your will be firm, for once spoken, they cannot be unsaid." Faramir drew a deep breath and began to recite the ancient formula. "I, Faramir, son of Denethor, heir of Anarion, do willingly take upon myself the burden of the Master Stone of Numenor. By my blood and by my oath, I bind its power to my spirit, that it may trouble the world no more. This I swear by the flame imperishable that burns at the heart of Arda." As the last word left his lips, the stone flared with brilliant light, and a sound like thunder rolled across the marshes. The dead warriors beneath the water stirred in their eternal sleep, and for a moment their faces turned upward as if they too could hear the words that were being spoken above. But it was upon Elendil that the greatest change came. The Phantom Princess threw back her head and cried aloud in a voice of joy and triumph, "Girth and Glamhoth, death to the orcs! I am free! I am free at last!" The ring upon her finger blazed like a star, and then crumbled to silver dust that scattered upon the wind. Her form grew brighter and more solid, until she seemed no longer a spirit, but a living woman of flesh and blood. And in that moment, Faramir understood the great secret that had been hidden for 3,000 years. "You were never dead," he said in wonder. "The ring did not preserve your spirit. It preserved your life. You have been alive all this time, trapped in these waters by the power of the stone." Elendil smiled through tears of joy. "Even so, Prince of Ithilien, I am the last of the Numenorians of the elder days, kept alive by the power of that accursed ring, waiting for one who would willingly share my burden. And now that burden is shared, the binding is changed, and both our spirits are free to choose their fate." In the days that followed the ritual of binding, strange changes came upon both Faramir and Elendil. The Prince of Ithilien found that he could perceive things that had been hidden from mortal sight, the movements of the elves who still dwelt in Middle-earth, the slow healing of the lands that had been scarred by war, and the gradual fading of the power that had once made these realms so fair and terrible. Elendil, freed at last from the phantom existence that had held her for so long, proved to be a woman of remarkable wisdom and strength. Though she appeared no older than Lothiriel, her eyes held the depth of ages, and her knowledge of the elder days was beyond that of any scholar in Gondor. She walked now upon dry land as easily as she had once moved through water, and the rangers marveled at her skill with sword and bow, for she had learned much during her long watch over the dead marshes. "The stone speaks to me now," Faramir confided to his companions as they prepared to leave that accursed place behind them. "I can feel its presence, like a weight upon my thoughts, but it is not the crushing burden that I had feared. Perhaps because the guardianship is now shared between two spirits, the load is lighter for each. Or perhaps," suggested Elendil, "it is because we go now toward the sea, and the stone longs to return to the place of its making. Numenor may be drowned beneath the waves, but the power that wrought the Palantiri remembers still the music of the water, the cry of the gull." Their path westward led them through lands that few travelers had seen in the years since the War of the Ring. They passed through the ruins of Tharbad, where the ancient bridge of the Númenóreans still spanned the Grey Flood, though ivy now grew thick upon its stone. They rode through the empty valleys of Minhiriath, where once great forests had stood before the shipwrights of Númenor, felled them for their fleets. It was in these wild lands that they encountered others who traveled the same road, though for different reasons. On the 7th day of their journey, they came upon a company of elves making their way westward with the slow, stately pace of those who go to a departure that has been long delayed. Their leader was Galdor of the Grey Havens, whom Faramir remembered from the tales of the War of the Ring. The elf lord greeted them courteously, but his eyes lingered long upon Elendil, as if he saw in her something that stirred memories of the elder days. "Lady," he said at last, "there is about you an air of the undying land, though I perceive that you have never sailed the straight road. Tell me, are you perhaps one of those whom the Valar have marked for special grace?" Elendil inclined her head with the dignity of her ancient lineage. "I am the daughter of Elendil, though the chronicles of men have forgotten. For 3,000 years I have kept watch over a burden too dangerous for any one realm to bear, and now the time has come to carry it beyond the circles of the world." Galdor's eyes widened, for he was old, even among the elves, and remembered well the coming of the Númenórean refugees to Lindon. "If you speak truly, then you are she who was lost in the great storm that scattered Elendil's fleet. Gil-galad mourned your passing, for he had hoped that your wisdom would aid in the defeat of Sauron." "My wisdom was needed elsewhere," replied Elendil simply. "But tell me, Lord of the Elves, what news do you bring from the Grey Havens? Does Círdan the shipwright still dwell there? And would he have ears for our petition?" "He does indeed. And more than that, he has been expecting you. 3 nights past, he looked into the waters of his harbor and saw a vision of a ship with silver sails bearing 2 passengers toward the west. He has commanded that a vessel be made ready, though he warned that the passage you seek is fraught with perils that even his skill cannot entirely overcome." This news brought both hope and concern to the company, for they had not expected their coming to be foreseen. As they traveled onward together with Galdor's folk, Elendil spoke long with the elf lord concerning the dangers that might await them upon the straight road. "The Master Stone must not be allowed to look upon the undying land while any of Sauron's malice remains in it," she explained. "If it should do so, it might send word of that vision back to any of the lesser Palantiri that yet remain in Middle-earth, and that knowledge could be used by those who would work evil." "Then how do you propose to transport it safely?" asked Galdor. "There is a way," replied Elendil, "but it will require that one of us remain in constant communion with the stone throughout the voyage, holding its power in check by sheer force of will. It is a task that might well drive the Guardian to madness before journey's end." Faramir, who had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding, spoke quietly. "That burden will be mine to bear, for I am already marked by the stone's touch, and my spirit has been prepared for the ordeal through the ritual of binding." But Elendil shook her head. "Nay, my friend, for there is yet another danger that we have not spoken of. The stone was made by Sauron, and though the Dark Lord is gone, something of his malice may yet linger within it. If that evil should fully awaken during our voyage, it might seek to possess the one who guards it. Better that 2 should share the watch, so that if one should falter, the other might take up the burden. At last, After many days of travel through the wild lands of Eriador, the company came within sight of the Grey Haven, and all who beheld that ancient port felt their hearts lift, despite the weight of the task that lay before them. The harbor lay like a jewel set in silver, with white towers rising above the water, and ships of elvish make riding at anchor like swans upon a lake. But it was the ship that waited at the end of the longest pier that drew all eyes and caused the hearts of the travelers to quicken with both hope and fear. She was unlike any vessel that had been built in the harbors of Middle-earth since the elder days. Her hull was wrought of timber from the white tree of Numenor itself, which Círdan had preserved through all the years since the island's drowning. Her sails were woven from spider silk and starlight, and her prow bore the image of Arundel's ship carved in mithril and set with gems from the treasuries of Elrond. Círdan the shipwright stood upon the quay to greet them, and though ages had passed since his making, he seemed no older than when he had first set foot upon the shores of Middle-earth. His hair was silver as the foam of the sea, and his eyes held the depth of waters that had looked upon the light of the two trees. "Welcome, children of the Second Age," he said, and his voice carried the music of waves upon a distant shore. "Long have I waited for this day, though I confess I had not foreseen all the paths that would lead to it. Come, let us speak together of the voyage that lies ahead, for there are things you must know before you commit your spirits to the keeping of the sea." In the hall above the harbor, maps were spread upon tables of driftwood, polished smooth by centuries of tides. These were charts unlike any that mortal mariners had ever seen, showing not only the curves of coastlines and the depths of waters, but the currents of power that flowed between the world and the realm of the Valar. "The straight road is not what it once was," Círdan explained, tracing with his finger a line that seemed to shimmer with its own light upon the ancient parchment. "When the world was made round, and Numenor was drowned beneath the waves, the paths between the circles of the world became harder to find and more perilous to follow. Only those who bear the right of passage, granted by the Valar themselves, can hope to complete the journey, and even then, success is not assured." "Bo, what dangers do we face?" asked Faramir, studying the charts with the eye of one trained in the lore of war. "The greatest danger is this," replied Círdan gravely. "The straight road passes through regions where time and space flow differently than in the world we know. A moment's inattention, a single false step, and the voyager may find himself cast into the void between the stars, or worse, trapped in a realm where neither death nor life hold sway." Elendiliel leaned forward, her face pale but determined. "And what of the stone we carry? Will its power affect our passage?" "That is the crux of the matter," said Círdan. "The Master Stone was wrought with malice, and though that malice sleeps now, the very act of approaching the undying lands may awaken it. If it should do so while you are upon the straight road, the results could be catastrophic, not only for yourselves, but for all who dwell in the Blessed Realm." Bidui, the weight of this revelation settled upon the company like a heavy cloak, and for a long moment none spoke. Then Faramir raised his head, and his eyes were bright with the light of resolve. "Nevertheless, we must make the attempt," he said. "The stone cannot remain in Middle-earth, where it might fall into the hands of those who would use its power for evil. Better to risk all in one bold stroke than to leave such a burden for future generations to bear." Círdan nodded slowly, spoken like a true heir of Elendil. "Very well, the ship is yours, and I will sail with you as far as the borders of the Enchanted Isles. Beyond that point, you must trust to your own courage and the grace of the Valar." As the day of departure dawned, the company made their final preparations with heavy hearts, for all knew that this parting might be their last in the mortal world. The rangers who had served so faithfully would return to Gondor with word of their prince's fate, while Luthiriel had chosen to remain at the Grey Havens until word came of the voyage's outcome. "If we do not return within 1 year's turning," Faramir said to Mablung as they embraced in farewell, "then you must tell the king that the stone is destroyed and the threat ended. Let no one seek for us beyond the Western Sea, for we shall have found either victory or a rest more final." than death. The Master Stone lay in a casket of mithril in the ship's hold, wrapped in veils of silk from Lorien and bound about with spells of warding that Círdan himself had wrought. Yet even so contained, its presence could be felt by all aboard, like a distant thunder or the memory of storm winds upon a peaceful day. As the white ship sailed from the grey havens into the sunset, those who watched from the shore saw her sails catch fire with the light of the dying day, until she seemed not a vessel of wood and cloth, but a star that had fallen to earth, and now sought to return to its place in the heaven. The voyage began fair, with gentle winds filling the silver sails, and the ship cutting through the waves like a knife through silk. For 3 days they sailed westward under skies that grew ever clearer and more beautiful, until the very air seemed to shimmer with light that had no earthly source. But on the 4th day, as they approached the borders of the Enchanted Isles, the Master Stone began to stir in its casket, and Faramir felt its awakening like fire in his veins. The ancient malice that Sauron had woven into its making sensed the nearness of the undying lands, and fought against the bonds that held it quiescent. "The time has come," said Elendiliel, her face set with grim determination. "We must begin the vigil that will carry us through to journey's end, or see all our hopes come to naught." Together they descended into the ship's hold, where the casket lay upon an altar of white stone that Círdan had carved with runes of protection. As they opened the mithril box, the stone blazed forth with dark fire, and visions began to dance in its depths, images of war and ruin, of kingdoms falling and darkness triumphant. "Do not look upon the vision," warned Elendiliel, though her own eyes were fixed upon the swirling depths of the Palantir. "They are lies meant to break our will and turn us from our purpose." Hour by hour they maintained their watch, taking turns to hold the stone's malice in check, while the other rested. The strain was enormous, for the Palantir fought them with all the cunning that Sauron had put into its making. It showed them false images of their loved ones in peril, whispered promises of power and dominion, and sought always to make them believe that their sacrifice was in vain. On the 7th day, Círdan came to them with news both wonderful and terrible. "We have passed beyond the Enchanted Isles," he said, "and the straight road lies open before us. But I can go no further, for my fate is bound to Middle-earth until the last ship sails from the Grey Havens. From this point, you must trust to the winds of heaven and the skill that I have built into this vessel." As the shipwright's boat disappeared into the mists astern, Faramir and Elendiliel found themselves alone upon the straight road, with only the treacherous Palantir for company. The very nature of the world seemed to change around them, as if they sailed not upon water, but through the substance of light itself. It was then that the stone made its final, desperate attempt to escape destruction. The casket burst asunder with a sound like thunder, and the Master Stone rose into the air above them, blazing with malevolent fire. In its depths, they saw the eye of Sauron himself, not as he had been in life, but as something far more terrible, the concentrated essence of malice and hatred given form. "You have brought me to the very gates of Valinor," the voice of the Dark Lord spoke from the stone, though Sauron himself was long destroyed. "Now I shall look upon the undying lands and carry word of their secrets back to any who serve the darkness in Middle-earth." But Elendiliel laughed, and her laughter was like silver bells ringing across the water. "Fool! Did you think we brought you here by chance? Look about you, O Sauron, and see where your malice has brought you." For the first time since the stone had awakened, the Dark Lord's voice faltered, and the eye in the Palantir's depths widened with something that might have been fear. They had not come merely to the borders of the undying lands. They had sailed into the very heart of Valinor itself, where the light of the two trees still shone upon the shores of eternity, and in that light no shadow could endure. The malice that had sustained the stone's power for so many ages began to burn away like mist before the dawn, and the voice of Sauron rose to a shriek of rage and despair before fading into silence forever. The Master Stone cracked like an egg, and crumbled to dust that scattered upon the winds of heaven, carrying with it the last remnant of the shadow that had once threatened to consume all Middle-earth. But for Faramir and Elendiliel, the light brought not destruction, but healing. The bonds that had tied them to the stone were broken, and they felt their spirits freed at last from the burden they had carried. Before them stretched the white shores of the undying land, where elves and men who had served the light could find rest and renewal before choosing whether to return to the world or pass beyond the circles of time altogether. "What will you choose?" asked Elendiliel, as their ship touched the crystal sand of that blessed shore. Faramir smiled, and for the first time in many years his face was free from shadow. "I think," he said, "that after a rest of perhaps a year or two in this timeless realm, I shall return to Middle-earth and to my wife, who waits for me in Ithilien. For though the undying lands are fair beyond words, my heart belongs to the mortal world and to those I love. And I," said Elendiliel, "shall remain here for a time to learn what became of my father and my brothers in the halls of Mandos, and perhaps to find at last the peace that 3,000 years of waiting could not give me." Thus ended the tale of She Drowned in the Dead Marshes, with the Master Stone destroyed and its guardians freed to choose their own fate. And though the chronicles of men remember it not, the deed they did that day ensured that never again would the malice of Sauron trouble the peace of Middle-earth, for the last and greatest of his works of treachery had been cast into the light and consumed utterly. In years to come, when travelers pass by the dead marshes, they find them chained. The faces of the dead warriors sleep peacefully beneath the waters, and no longer do strange lights dance above the mere, for the sorrow that bound those ancient heroes to that place has been lifted, and they have found at last the rest that their valor earned in the Battle of Dagorlad. And sometimes, on nights when the moon is full and the water lies still as glass, fishermen report hearing voices singing in the ancient tongue of Numenor, not songs of lament and loss, but songs of joy and triumph, as if the very marshes themselves remember the courage of those who carried darkness into light and emerged victorious. Here ends the tale of Elendiliel, daughter of Elendil, and of Prince Faramir of Ithilien, who together bore the Master Stone beyond the circles of the world and saw it destroyed in the light of Valinor. May their names be remembered as long as tales are told in Middle-earth, and may their courage inspire all who face darkness with naught but hope and honor as their weapon.